Hi, so I decided to do another vlog to talk through Amal Unbound because I just found the experience really valuable last week, because with all of these books I feel like I've learned so much good stuff that I can't wait to talk about in my future classroom with my kiddos. So I think that like practicing talking through all these important ideas now is really good practice for the future so that I'll be more prepared to do it with my students. So I started this book last Sunday just to get ahead because I had all my other homework done, and I was like, I'm just going to read 50 pages tonight and just get a dent in my homework for the week. But I couldn't put it down. It was so good. It was around page 50 when this main part of the story started up, and I just couldn't put it down. So I read almost the whole thing in one sitting, and then the next day I finished it off. But I think I just really connected with this book like more than any others that we've read, and I just found that experience to be really valuable, because I think when we present books to kids in our class, we don't ever know. I mean, of course you know your students well, but there are parts of me that no one really knows, that only I know about myself. So I think that you just never know how a kid is going to resonate with a book. And you know, I didn't expect to really connect with this book in the way I did. I knew that it would be really good, but I didn't think that there was anything that I could personally connect to. It's a book for kids, and it's a book set in Pakistan, but it was the total opposite. I felt like I knew Amal so well, and I saw so much of myself in her while I read it. And I listened to an interview with Aisha Saeed about the book, and she said that she spent on all of her books, she spends a really long time developing the characters and their nuances and just trying to give them a lot of complexity. And I think that she really did that, because every single character in this book is so unique and has such unique character traits, like characters that I expected to hate, like Jahid's mom, Nahil, I think was her name. I'm struggling to remember. I have it in my notes. But I expected to hate her because she was the one that was keeping Amal there. And I expected her to be so mean and demanding, but she wasn't like that at all. It was actually the opposite. She treated Amal really fairly, and they had a lot to connect about. So I think that's just like a very important part of this book, is showing that the humanity of people, like even people in such high power, they're still human, and just seeing that someone is not always all bad. But she said that she did struggle to create the landlord character, and she tried as she was writing the book to see what good she could bring out of him, but she also just had to accept that he's just not a good person, and some people just aren't. So Aisha Saeed's inspiration for writing this book, she grew up in Pakistan, and she grew up in a village just like Amal's, but it was set in the village that her mother grew up in. That's what she based it around, because she remembers going there and playing in the fields, and there was sugar cane just like Amal's family harvested to make a living. And the goal of writing this book for her was just to share the beauty of Pakistan, because I mean, just like a lot of other places, there are a lot of bad assumptions that people have about it. So I think she, by sharing a story of an ordinary family that most kids can connect with, I think that she really did a good job of showing the beauty of it, that it's not all fighting and all this terrible stuff like the preconceived notions that people may have. And so she wanted to share a story of bravery that would never make headlines, to show that even any act of bravery, no matter how small, is really important. And I think that that is so important. And just from reading Bunkuckle and me last week, to show that any act of activism, sorry, my cat is here. Any act of activism matters, and that no matter how small it is, it matters. So to share this story of Amal that really wasn't a big deal, not big enough to make news story or headlines or anything like that, but what she did made a difference in her life and the lives of others. So just showing that that matters, I think Aisha Saeed did an amazing job of that. And she's a mom of 3 boys, and she just talked a lot about in her interview that to be a writer is not what she expected. When she used to consider writing, she thought it had to be in a coffee shop in the perfect setting, but through being a mom, she's just learned that she just writes anytime she can and just gets words on the paper. And I think if I read this book with my students, I would play her interview to them just to inspire their writing as well. Like, she's an author who wrote this amazing book that we loved, and she's saying that anybody can write. You just have to sit down and do it often to be good at it. So she expected older siblings to connect with this book, which when I heard that I was like, because I am an older sibling. My sister is 7 years younger than me, so we're really, really close. She's 15 now and I'm 22, so we have more of that friendship, but I also mom her so bad. We joke about it all the time. And so I really connected with Amal's character of feeling responsible a lot of times and feeling like you have to step in if you're needed, and she really did have to do that in this book. So one of the main things that I loved about this book is the emotion that it evoked in me. I cried so many times while reading this book just because I felt for Amal and for her family and for the people who were working under the Khan family at the house where Amal went to be a servant. And I just think that a really important lesson that students can get out of this book is Amal always speaking up for what she believed in, even when it put her in danger. Like, even with her dad, she told her dad, like, this isn't fair, I want to go to school. Like, she always stood up for what she believed in. Even small things, like with her friends about her teacher, she would just always say how she truly felt instead of just agreeing with someone to fit in. And she struggled with that once she moved over to be a servant, because she really had to learn her place and to kind of keep her mouth shut in order to survive. And so one thing that I think was really addressed throughout this book is poverty, because all of the families in Amal's village were basically living under the Khan family's rule because they owed him so much money. And I think that that's a common thing in poverty, especially in countries where people have been oppressed for so long. Because I remember going to the Dominican Republic and I was young, and I just thought, well, why doesn't our country just give these people a bunch of money? It will solve all their problems. But people in those situations, money isn't the problem. They need to learn other things. And so a lot of these families had no choice but to turn to this family who was in so much power already for help, because they had no other option. But that was just putting them further and further oppressed. And I also found the Nasreen Bahi is the mom. That's the name. Sorry, I couldn't remember it. I found her story to be really complex and like served major importance in this story, because she grew up basically just like Amal. She knew a lot of the same people that Amal did, but now she's in this high position of power. But the question throughout the book is she really more free than any of these other families? Because it doesn't seem that way. And she left her family and basically traded in that part of her life to not be oppressed anymore. So I thought that that was an interesting part of the story, because she grew up that way and now she's living with a lot of money, but I don't know that she is truly happy. And so that brings me to my next point, which was freedom. Freedom was talked a lot about in the book. And just one question that I asked myself while I read was, did Nasreen Bahi truly have freedom? And one of the pages that brought that question for me was 176. It was a quote that I wanted to share. So Amal says, Nasreen Bahi had a bedroom that was practically the size of my house and the finest food and clothing, but she couldn't see the people she wanted to see most. Her cage was nicer than mine, but it was still a cage. So she has a nice house and she has all these things that so many people desire for, but she lost such a big part of her life to get there. So is she truly free? That's something that I would love to dive into with students, because I think that they would really have a good perspective on that. And then she also makes a connection to enslavement on page 109 that I really resonated with. She says, I doubted I would ever get used to being discussed like cattle at the market. So Amal goes from being this girl who is able to go to school and she's so smart and she values education so much, to being someone who stands in the corner and is talked about by Nasreen Bahi's friend, like, where do you get people like that? Like, she's a piece of property. And so I just made that connection to some of the books that we've read about enslaved people. And then Amal found a lot of her freedom in books, and that was such an important part of her life. She loved to read, and she was actually really privileged to be able to read, and she spread that with so many people once she became a servant. She started to help another little girl learn how to read, and I thought that was a really cool part of the story too, because she wanted to be a teacher, and she felt like that had been taken from her when she was forced to leave her family and go work as a servant. So I thought that was a really key part of the story. And then gender roles are obviously very, very prevalent in this story. Because Amal is the oldest and she's a female, she has to stay home from school and give up her education because that's just the way that things are. And a son keeps the family going, and her family was very upset that the mom had another daughter, and people were coming over and acting sad for them as if they had lost a child. And Amal didn't understand, like, look at this perfect, healthy baby and you're all so sad. She couldn't understand why they were upset. But I also thought it was interesting because Amal's parents' relationship seemed like a partnership. Amal's mom was very strong, even though it was obvious that she struggled with depression, and I wanted to talk about that as well. But I thought it was unique that her mom stood up to her dad. It wasn't like he was just telling her this is the way it's going to be. She also gave her peace of mind, which is I think a big part of who Amal is. She's probably seen her mom be strong like that her entire life. So I thought that was really important. It addresses gender inequity. So on page 43, Amal says, this is when her dad and her are talking about that she can't go to school anymore. And she said, but did it really have to be this way? If I were a boy, would I be staying home to fold laundry and iron clothes? If I were a son, would he so casually tell me to forget my dreams? And I think that is really important because, I mean, we do a lot of the time society does expect even little girls to take on the role of doing things that a mother would typically do. And is that right? I don't think there's anything wrong with chores, but I think that boys should have the same expectations as girls. Even our small boys, they can do things like help with laundry and help with dishes. It's not just this divide that's like that's a boy job or that's a girl job. And I think that starts at a young age because kids don't know until they're taught that. So I think that statement from Amal is just really important. And through Amal's mom, I think we just learned so much. Even though it's early on in the book, I just loved her character, and I loved the way that the author addressed postpartum depression, because that's not really something that's talked about, but I have seen my own mother go through that when she had my sister, and it was really hard as a child because I didn't understand. I was like, this is supposed to be a happy time. I felt very lonely, and it was just so hard on my mom, and no one around us really thought that it was important. Like, if you're sick, then people come and bring you things, but if you mentally are sick, people don't really have that same reaction. They're just like, pull it together, like you've got to get it together. But that's not how it should be. That mental illness and illness should go hand in hand in importance, but it doesn't always. So that just really resonated with me as well. There was a lot of discussion about the fairness of life throughout this book. Amal's dad really stressed that to her, like, life just isn't fair, this is the way it has to be. And it was kind of this internal battle for Amal, like, well, just because people say that, is that true, or should I do something about it? And I mean, in the end, she obviously stands up and does something about it and takes action. But so often people are like, well, this is just the way it is, this is the way my life is, and they don't do anything to change it. So I think that her character is really inspiring. Another part that just made me really sad is when she got to go visit her family, and they treated her really special, which was awesome, and they kind of gave her a break, but they called her a guest in her own home. And I think that I connected with that a lot because I had a really hard time when I left for college because I'm a homebody and I love being with my family. And I remember coming home on the weekends and my mom would say, like, oh, take this back up home with you. And I was like, that is not my home, this is my home. And so just that idea of being away from your family, and obviously I was privileged to be away from my family. I was going to college. I'm very, very lucky. But it was still the same struggle, like you're missing out on things that your family is doing. And the connection Amal has to her friend, like, people's lives are still going on and you're having to miss out on all these things. It's really hard. And I just cannot imagine being forced to do that at such a young age. I mean, she had to be away from her family. She was missing all these things, but she was so strong. And then I loved this quote on page 169. So this is when she gets to go to the wedding and people are talking about Jawab Sahid, and she just says, she was right. For these women, my circumstances were a juicy story, one they could whisper about and cluck their tongues over before moving on to other things. They didn't have to tiptoe around Jawab Sahid. They didn't have to be wrenched away from everyone they love. They weren't bad people. They were just lucky enough to have no idea of the reality that I faced. And that just struck me so hard, because that's just such a mature thought for someone her age who's having to go through something so hard, for her to be able to say, like, they're not bad people, they just are so lucky to not have to go through what I go through. And I think that can help us understand some kids that we have in our classrooms and things that they go through, because we truly can never understand them, and we're very lucky because of that. But we just need to know, like, they're more than an interesting story. When bad things happen to people, we need to stand up and make a change, not just whisper about it and say, oh, that's so awful, or this is just the next interesting story. Like, it's up to each individual to make a change. And of course, I loved the part of the story when Amal gets to go to the literacy center, even if it is for superficial reasons. The teacher is really awesome, and I just loved, like, his passion and the way that he wants to help Amal, and the kind of the inspiration that he gives her. And then finally, obviously this book was so centered around bravery, and I just think Amal is so brave. And so on page 210, near the end of the book, she says, someone tells her how brave she was for what she did to get justice, basically, for what Jawab did. And she says, I'm not brave, I'm terrified, I just don't have a choice. You always have a choice. Making choices even when they scare you because you know it's right is the right thing to do. That's bravery. So I think that a lot of times, just like we have talked about in class, kids have this idea of bravery of that it's Superman, it's someone that goes out and saves the world and has special powers, but being brave isn't always easy. It's hard. And a lot of the times when people are brave, they really have no other choice. They're doing it because their life depends on it. So I think just that quote right there could bring up so many good conversations in a classroom about what is bravery? What do you think makes someone brave? So I loved this book so much. I hope that I teach an older grade, even if it's a read aloud. I want to read this book with kids so bad and just talk through all the important things that this book covered.